Hello everybody, my name's Justin Fisher and I'm a Professor of Political Science here at Brunel University London, and I'm also Head of the Department of Social and Political Sciences. And what I'm going to do today is talk to you about electoral change in Britain, looking at how the electoral landscape has changed from the end of the Second World War right up until today. And we're going to be looking at a series of questions. And the first of these is the extent to which there's been some change, or has it been all change? And I think what I want to point out first is that it's very clear that the proportion of voters who've chosen the Labour Party or the Conservative Party has declined significantly over time. Though it has to be said that in the last two elections, these parties actually bounced back somewhat and were more popular relative to the other parties in Britain. But what's important to remember, and it's a theme to which we shall return throughout this talk, is that the share of the seats won by those two parties has declined rather less. So we're going to be looking both at the share of the votes, what proportion of people vote for which party, but also the seats that the parties win. What share do they have in the House of Commons? And it's fair to say that what we're going to see is that we do have more of a multi-party system in Britain at national level, at Westminster level, but it's not necessarily an extensive one. So let's look at some data on this. So what we have here is the share of the vote across the whole of the UK, that's England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, over the period from 1945 right through to the election last December. And what you can see here are two broad trends. These top two lines here, the blue and the red lines, those are the Conservative and Labour parties. And as you can see, over time, that's declined. You can also see that the share of the vote for other parties, so the orange line, that's the party that's currently called the Liberal Democrats, but until 1988 was the Liberals and also the Alliance, the SDP Liberal Alliance. That's tended to grow up until around 2010 and then it's fallen away. But what we also see is that the votes for other parties have also increased over time. So we've seen a narrowing between the two. Now just look at the vote shares that the parties picked up back in 1945. Labour got nearly 50% of the vote, and the Conservatives, although a distant second, still managed to pick up 40%. Now those vote shares now are rather less. So let's then look at the share of the seats. Now here we see that there's a difference between the two. There has been some minor decline in the share of the seats won by the Conservative and the Labour parties, and there has been an increase in the share of the seats won by the Liberal Democrats up until the mid-2000s, and then other parties since then. But the rate of change has been rather less, and that's a very, very important point to remember. Now, there's another way in which we can look at these data to get a better idea of what's happening. And that's by combining the share of the vote for the Conservative and Labour parties and the share of the seats for the Conservative and Labour parties over the period. And that's what we do in this graph. So the solid line is the combined vote share for both the Conservative and Labour parties, and the dotted line is the combined share of the seats. Now what you can see is that the share of the vote was clearly declining fairly substantially. So if we go back, for example, to 1951, we see that over 95% of all voters voted either Conservative or Labour. If we then look at 2010, that has declined to only around 64 or 65%. Now actually it's gone up rather in the last few elections, so that in 2017, for example, we were back up to around 80%, or slightly over 80% share of the vote for those two parties. It dipped again in 2019. So overall, there's been a decline, although something of a recovery in the last couple of elections. But look at the share of the seats. That's the dotted line. That's declined over time, but not nearly as steeply. Again, if we go back to 1951, we see that the Conservative and Labour parties held around 98% of all the seats in the House of Commons. Now that's declined somewhat, but it's still around 88% in 2019. So there's been a decline in the share of the seats, but not nearly as steep as a decline in the share of the votes. Now, why does that matter? Well, it matters because it tells us something about both how multi-party Britain is, but also about how the electoral system translates those votes into seats. In terms of votes, it would look like we were becoming more multi-party, but in terms of seats, rather less so. We can look at another way of expressing this. And this is a measure that political scientists use to try and capture the size of the party system. It's called the effective number of parties. Now, I won't bore you with the arithmetic of how this is calculated, but the key number here is 2. The degree to which the party system is over 2 describes the extent to which the party has moved away from being a pure two-party system, Conservative and Labour. If it goes below 2, it means we have more of a one-party state, one where one party really dominates. And as you can see in this graph here, which looks at the effective number of electoral parties, that's based on vote share, and the effective number of parliamentary parties based on seat share, we do see a change in British politics away from a pure two-party system, but the rate of change differs depending on whether you look at vote share or seat share. Let's take vote share. That's the solid line here. That shows that if we go back to 1951, again, a really good example, we had pretty much a two-party system. And that the size of that party system has grown over time to the extent that in 2010, we could describe the UK as having a party system that was at least the size of 3.5 parties, because as you see, the line there exceeds 3.5. Now, it's gone down a bit since then, but even in 2019, it was still the score over 3. But let's then look at the effective number of parliamentary parties. This is looking at seat share. What we see here is a growth in the size of the party system, but not nearly as large as we see in terms of vote share. And this is a critical point. When we talk about the extent to which Britain is a multi-party system, there is a difference between who people vote for and the people who represent them in Parliament. People who represent them in Parliament are rather more dominated by the main two parties than is necessarily reflected in the seats, in the vote share. Okay, so that gives you some background. It tells us that there has been change. We've become a bit more multi-party, and it depends which one you measure to tell you how much more multi-party. But why has this happened? Well, we can look at a number of reasons. The first important reason is that there has been a declining loyalty to parties. And we're going to look at some evidence that shows how we might capture that. And I think we can point to 4 broad trends. First and foremost, the proportion of strong supporters, people who will always, almost always, or always vote for their party, has been declining steadily. And it's now below 20% of people who side with one party or another. Now, it's one of the things I always say to my students is it's often useful not to think of politics as being different from the rest of real life, but to think of it as being similar to another aspect. And actually, when we think about strong supporters, a very good analogy is supporting a football team. Now, when we say that I support a football team, and let's say for the sake of argument that team is Brentford Football Club, we might say that there are different types of supporters. There are supporters who go to every game. They're the season ticket holders. There are supporters who go to some games and will want to cheer the club on. And there are some supporters who don't go to any games, but always look out for their results in the newspaper. Now, all of them lean towards one team rather than another, but the strength of their support varies. And what we're interested in here is the proportion of strong supporters, if you like, the season ticket holders behind a party. I'm going to show you some graphs in a minute which illustrate how that's changed. So fewer than 20% of supporters now describe themselves as being really strong. The second thing we see is that voting on the basis of class has declined very, very steeply. If we go back to the 1950s and 1960s, if we could have a good idea of how someone was going to vote on the basis of their social class, looking at their occupation. But that changed very much in the 70s and has continued to decline ever since, to the extent that social class has become almost irrelevant in terms of predicting electoral behavior. The third thing that we observe is that there's been a broad decline over time in terms of satisfaction with government and satisfaction with leaders. Broadly speaking, what we see is that over time, people have become less enamored, much more critical of how governments have performed and how their leaders have performed. And that's led to a decline in their loyalty to either their party or whether or not they would think of voting for another one. Now, as you'll see, the exception here is actually the first Blair government, and I'll show you some data which illustrate that point really, really well. And then fourthly, what we've seen is the growth of national parties, both in Wales, but particularly in Scotland. Parties based not around traditional social divisions like class, but more around national identity. And that's become particularly important in Scotland, where of course we see at Scottish Parliament level, the Scottish National Party being in power and being a very powerful party in Scotland for some years now. Now, all of these trends are much easier to illustrate with some data. So I'm going to start with this proportion of strong supporters. Now, what this graph illustrates are answers to two questions surrounding what we describe as partisan identification. And what partisan identification is a measure of whether you are closer to one party or another, and if you are closer to one party, how strong that commitment is. Now, the reason we begin in 1964 is not because there's anything particularly special about 1964, but simply that this was the first election where academics ran what's known as the British Election Study. This is a very, very large study where we gather data about how people have voted and why they voted as they have. Now, this graph gives us two important bits of information. The first important bit of information is the blue line, this line at the top here. And this tells us what proportion of the electorate say that they lean towards one party or another. In other words, if they said, which is your favorite party, they would have an answer to that question. And what we see is that that has declined, but not that much. If we go back to 1964, over 90% of all voters said they leant towards one party or another. That's declined, and so it's at that figure now is at around 80%. So some decline, but not a huge decline. The more significant information in this graph is in these three lines down here. So this is a second question which is asked on the British Election Study, which says, okay, if you lean towards a particular party, how strong is that commitment? And this is my example of the season ticket holder, the person who goes to a few games, or the person who just looks out for results. So these season ticket holders, the very strong people, they're the red line here. The fairly strong, that's the green line here, and the not very strong, that's the orange line here. Now, the critically important line in this graph is this red line. And what we see here is that at a time in the 60s when most people lent towards one party, nearly 50% of those people lent towards that party very, very strongly. In other words, it would take something really, really huge for them to vote against their team, for them to vote against their party. And that really continued up until 1970. But after that, we see a steep decline in the 70s and a continuing decline ever since, such that fewer than 20% of these voters now see themselves as being really strong supporters. By way of contrast, the proportion of people who say that they are not very strong, that they lean to one side or the other, they see themselves more of a conservative, more of a Labour person, more of a Lib Dem or whatever, the proportion of these people has grown over time, such that it's around 30% of those people with a partisan identity. Now, so far so good. What we might say there is that loyalty to parties is declining. And are we heading for a period where we might say there is no loyalty to parties? Well, that I think would be exaggerating the case. And the reason for that is that if we look at this line, this green line, it's barely changed since 1964. It's still bobbing around 40 to 45% of those people who align with a party still see themselves as being a fairly strong aligner, someone who goes to a few games a season, if you like. So it's certainly the case that loyalty has declined, but it hasn't disappeared. Let's then look at another example. This is class voting. Now, there are many ways of measuring class voting, but this is a simple way of doing so. And it's based on the idea that people in some occupations would be more likely to vote Labour and others would be more likely to vote Conservative. Okay, and we look at Labour and Conservative because those are the parties that historically have had a kind of appeal to particular social classes. And what we see here is again a significant decline. And however you measure class voting, and this is just one measure here, we get the same results, that class voting is becoming increasingly irrelevant in terms of electoral behaviour. Knowing someone's class is increasingly a poor predictor of how they're going to vote. Now, we do get little fluctuations. So we got a little boost up here in 1992 and a small boost in 2017. But as we see in 2019, this was the lowest point of class voting in the period since 1964. So voting on the basis of class is disappearing in terms of importance. What about approval of government record? Well, what this captures is the idea that people are becoming less enamored of a party in government. And if it's their party in government, this might mean that they were likely to switch sides. Now, what this graph shows is the average approval rating for a government over an entire parliament. And we're able to start here in 1951 because Gallup, the polling company, as was, started collecting data on these things back in the 1950s. Now Ipsos Mori collect the data. And what we can see is that back in the 1950s, around 50% of us approved of government, what the government was doing. And that declined, but it was still pretty steady until the mid-60s. After that, it went into a steep decline and actually hit its depths in the John Major period of government between 1992 and 1997. Now, the one exception here is this period. This is the first period of government led by Tony Blair. And what we can see here is that not only was Mr. Blair's first term of government very, very popular, but was actually the most popular government since records began, going back to the early 1950s. His government was more popular, as you can see on the graph, than the 1951 to 55 government. But when you're that popular, the only way is down. And by 2005, during which, of course, there were some decisions which proved to be unpopular with some parts of the population, such as the introduction of additional student fees and of course the Iraq War, we see that popularity falls. That's the end of the Gordon Brown period in 2010. Popularity actually went up after that, up to 2017, but not surprisingly, people were fairly disillusioned with government in the period after the 2017 election, with all the difficulties that government faced over Brexit. And so we see a downward trend there, not quite as unpopular as John Major's government in 92 through 97, but not far off. Now, this is reflected to an extent in how we view our leaders, our Prime Minister and our leader of the opposition. So the solid line here is the proportion of people who are satisfied with the Prime Minister, and the dotted line are people who are satisfied with the leader of the opposition. And what we can see, broadly speaking, if we look at satisfaction with the Prime Minister, is a decline over time. If we go back to the 1950s, around 55% of people were very satisfied with Mr. Churchill, as it was at the start of that period of government, as leader or as Prime Minister of the country. Mr. Churchill gave way after then. But even in the 1960s, there was great popularity. But since then, it's been declining, except for one peak period here when Tony Blair was Prime Minister. Again, not only was his government popular, but he personally was very popular as Prime Minister. But again, when you're that popular, the only way is down. And then towards the end of his period as Prime Minister, it was much more in line with previous PMs. Again, it went up slightly. Actually, for all of her difficulties, Theresa May was not as unpopular as many people thought. But in that period, in 2017 through 2019, we see again a decline in satisfaction with the Prime Minister. What about opposition leaders? Well, again, we see the same pattern, a decline in satisfaction with their performance, except this one spike here. And the leader of the opposition in this period is, yes, you've guessed it, Tony Blair, and of course, who went on to be Prime Minister. But that's declined steadily, just as satisfaction with Prime Ministers has. And we look at this line here. This is the period after the Conservatives came to power in 2010. And we can see that the Labour leaders became increasingly unpopular. And indeed, by the end of 2019, although this figure is an average from the period of 2017 to 2019, by the end of 2019, Jeremy Corbyn was the least popular opposition leader since records began. Now, all of these things add up together to mean that voters are likely to be less loyal to their parties and have the possibility of moving over to other parties. So, why did this happen? We've seen declining loyalty to parties. We've seen a decline in class voting. We've seen a decline in approval ratings of government and leaders. So why did these things happen? Well, there are a number of explanations. The first of which is, as a country, we've become better educated. Now, this has happened in two ways. First, over this period, people are staying on at school for much longer than they used to. And also many, many more people are going to university. Now, all of this matters because the more educated a nation is, often the more critical it is of its rulers. And what we've seen is that as people have been more educated, they have become more critical. They've understood politics much, much better and have been more critical of decisions that have been made. But the expansion of educational provision has also been very, very important socially, because what it's done is give people many, many more opportunities for social mobility, meaning that they may have been born into one type of background socially, but in terms of the opportunities they've had through education, have moved into a rather different social class because of their job. So they may have been born into a working class background, but the educational provision and the opportunities that that's provided has meant that many more people have started to inhabit more middle-class lifestyles and more middle-class occupations. The second thing that's important is technological change. So over this period, there's been very significant change in industry, such that heavy industry, which was very, very unionized, where strong trade union presence and strong communities that tended to be much more loyal to Labour in particular, have largely disappeared over this time. And we've moved from heavy industry to service industries and technological industries. Now, the important things about those industries is both that they are less unionized, but also that they are less likely to create strong local communities with a loyalty to a particular party. So in this sense, the old industrial working class that was based in heavy industry is largely disappearing, not because there are no longer any working class people, of course there are, but because that technology has meant that what used to bind many of those people together, trade unions and local communities, have disappeared as a result of technological change. The third one is one of my favorite words, embourgeoisement. And what this refers to is something that really began in the 1960s. So as living standards rose, many more people started to enjoy the fruits of what might previously have been thought of as rather middle-class lifestyles. So to give you an example, at the beginning of the 60s, relatively few people had televisions. By the end of the 60s, almost everybody had one. People started to get their own cars. There's a very, very good picture of when the M1 is first introduced. And what's striking about the picture is that there's only 2 or 3 cars on the entire motorway in a very long shot. And now, of course, we wouldn't see that. So people started to get cars. People started to go on foreign holidays and all the sorts of trappings of a middle-class lifestyle. And what this meant was that people's values started to change. As they started to enjoy these sorts of benefits from rising living standards, they wanted more of them. And this arguably led to a decline in things like class loyalty and loyalty to particular political parties. The fourth thing is that we've seen a growth in the critical coverage of politics. So if you go back to the 1950s, what you see is that journalists are very deferential towards politicians and allowing politicians to make their case almost unchallenged. Now, this began to change in the 1960s and has ramped up ever since, such that now we have a situation when it's almost the case that if a politician appears on the radio or on television, we almost expect them to be savaged by the journalists. Now, there is an argument that says that's actually gone too far. But the reason it matters in this context is because this sort of critical coverage has meant that people are more able to challenge their existing beliefs. If they were Labour supporters and they see Labour politicians being savaged, this means this may lead to a decline in loyalty, and ditto if they're Conservatives. And then fifthly, we've seen a growth in different social cleavages in Britain. Now, I mentioned class before because class was very important in the Conservative and Labour parties being the 2 principal parties in Britain, both of which appealing to particular social groups. But we've seen many new social cleavages, social groupings emerge. One of these I've mentioned already, the growth of national identity in Wales and particularly in Scotland. But British society has also changed a great deal in the post-war period. And so now we might have new ethnic groups with different identities, not identities around class, but identities, for example, around their ethnicity. Now, all of these things matter because they challenge the way in which people had loyalty to parties in the past. And a whole series of reasons explain why the changes that we've seen started to occur. So what has been the result of all of this? We've seen that party loyalty has declined. but it's not disappeared. And we've seen that social class voting has declined. We've seen that satisfaction with leaders and with governments has declined. But what's been the impact? Well, I think we can point to two very, very important aspects. Firstly, what we call a growth in voter volatility. Now, what voter volatility refers to is the likelihood that people will change sides from one election to another. That is, maybe vote Labour in one election and Liberal Democrat in another, or vote Conservative in one election and perhaps Labour in another, and so on and so forth. And we've seen a growth in that over time. The second thing that's very, very important is an increase in what we call late deciders. These are people who say that they made their mind up about how to vote during the campaign itself, what we call the short campaign, the point from which Parliament is dissolved up until polling day, which is usually around 5 weeks. Now, these data are captured in the British election study. And in 1964, only around 12% of voters said they made up their minds during the campaign. In the last election for which we have data on this, we don't have the 2019 data yet, but in 2017, that had risen to around 1/3 of all voters. 1/3 of all voters in 2017 said they made up their mind pretty much at the last minute. Now, why does that matter? Well, that matters because it increases the potential impact for what we call short-term factors, such as the popularity of leaders, the impact of campaigns, and the impact of the media. Now, the reason this is important is if you think about it, if you've decided how you're going to vote before the campaign itself starts, and you've decided to vote Conservative, it's going to matter less who the Conservative leader is. It's going to matter less how well the Conservative Party campaign, and it's going to matter less if the media is hostile or warm towards the Conservatives, because you've already decided to vote for them. And it's exactly the same for Labour or any other party. By way of contrast, if more voters are deciding later, if more voters are, if you like, up for grabs, then aspects like leaders, exemplified through leadership debates, the impact of campaigns and the impact of the media has the potential, at least, to be much greater. Now, I do a lot of work measuring the impact of campaigns at constituency level. And what we find is that where parties are already popular, their campaigns are less effective. Where they're already unpopular, their campaigns are less effective. But where they're somewhere in between, actually, they have great potential to be effective and indeed lead to seats changing hands. So let's look at some data on this. So what this is data again from the British election study, and it compares how people voted in 2 elections. So for example here, how did you vote in 1959, and then how did you vote in 1964, and all the way up to 2019. And what this captures is the proportion of people who changed parties, who voted for one party in one election and another in the next. And as you can see, this has gone up quite substantially. We can see that back in 1964, only around 17% of people changed parties. By 2017, that was 1/3 of the electorate. So 1/3 of the electorate changing sides from one election to the other. Now, this did dip down, in fact, in 2019, but it's still considerably higher than it was back in the 1960s. And what this shows is that the decline in voter loyalty has led to an increase in voter volatility. As people are less loyal to their side, they are more likely to switch sides election on election. What about the potential for short-term effects? Well, this captures the percentage of people who decided how to vote during the campaign. And as you can see, this has gone up substantially. Indeed, in 2010, that was its high point. something like 35%, 36% in fact, of all voters decided how they were going to vote, not beforehand, but during that short period between the dissolution of Parliament and election day itself. So that means those voters are up for grabs, and that there is greater potential for leader effects, for campaign effects, and for media effects. If very few people are deciding how to vote during the campaign, then the potential for these things is very small. So media effects are unlikely to be important in an election such as 1964 through to 1970. They're much more likely to be important when many more voters are undecided when Parliament is dissolved. So, what do we see overall? Well, we can see that there's been clear electoral change in terms of voting behaviour. People are voting differently, people are more likely to change sides, and votes for the smaller parties have increased. Now, this has been caused by a declining loyalty to the political parties, and in particular, the significant decline in class voting. So whereas in the 1960s, there's a very, very famous quotation that says, class is the basis of British politics and all else is embellishment and detail, that quotation looks a little bit silly these days, given that class has become almost irrelevant in terms of determining how people vote. The result, as we've seen, has been a more volatile electorate, an electorate that's prepared to change sides election on election, and who may respond more readily to short-term factors such as which leader they prefer, which campaign they think is better, and how parties are treated in the media. Now, this relates back to the popularity of leaders. If you're responding more to short-term effects, such as leadership effects, it matters if your leader is deeply unpopular. It wouldn't matter if people were deciding to vote a long time out from the election. But, and here's a really, really important point, and one I want you to take away. The declining loyalty to parties doesn't mean that there's no loyalty. Just because fewer people are strong supporters, it doesn't mean that all voters are up for grabs in every election. And what we also see is that whereas voting behaviour has changed, in terms of seats, the change over this period has been far less dramatic. We have seen a growth in multipartism, a move from two parties to a more multi-party system, but that change has been far less dramatic in terms of the share of the seats in the House of Commons. And it's an important point to remember. It is the seats you win that win elections, and vote share only tells part of the story. Again, a really nice analogy is a football match. We know that it doesn't matter if you have the ball for 90% of the game. If you don't score more goals than the other side, you're not going to win that match. And it's the same with seats. You've got to win seats to win elections, and that means you've got to get votes in the seats that matter, not pile up votes in seats that you're going to win anyway. Okay, I hope you've enjoyed that brief taster lecture. What I hope that you've got out of this is to see how we can look at these questions and, using the data that I have, show that there are a variety of interpretations and that the story isn't always very one-dimensional. There's always a yes but to these, and it's always important to think in these terms about how you might capture things like voter loyalty, how you might capture voter volatility, and so on and so forth. So at this point, I'll be very happy to take some questions, and hopefully you've been either jotting questions down in the chat room, or there's ones that you'd like to pose to me now. A question from Aisha, and Aisha says, is voting the most effective way to come to a united conclusion of whom should be elected, etc.? If so, why? If not, why not? Well, that's a really great question, really interesting one. I mean, the thing about elections is you have to think about what you want them to do. And this goes to the heart, if you like, of what electoral system you want. If you want in an election, if you want fundamentally to choose a government so that you have one party in charge, then it's likely that you probably want a system similar to the one that we have in the United Kingdom, what we call first past the post. If, however, you want an electoral system which reflects the broad range of opinion, but will be far less likely to produce a single party government, then you might want a more of a proportional system, such as we see in Wales, Scotland, or elections to the London Assembly. So in terms of most effective, I think the answer to that question is it depends what you want government to do. Do you want government to make decisions very quickly and with less consultation with other parties? Or do you want government to reflect a wide range of views and be subject to many, many more compromises? Now, of course, we've seen examples of both of that, even with our electoral system. So between 2010 and 2015, we had a coalition between the Conservative Party and the Liberal Democrats, and they had to agree with each other on certain policies. And of course, that turned out to be rather bad for the Liberal Democrats because they've not yet recovered the level of popularity they had before. If we look for the period between 2017 and 2019, although there wasn't a formal coalition, we had an electoral arrangement between the Conservative Party and the Democratic Unionist Party. And some people argue that that gave the smaller party far too much power in government because in effect, they could blackmail the government. If you don't do what we want, we'll withdraw support and you won't be able to govern. So in terms of Aisha's question, is it the most effective? Well, there's no perfect system. Fundamentally, what the best system for you is what is going to deliver the type of government that you want. And so I think elections are great. I think they're a fantastic thing. And I think they are the way in which we express what we want as voters. But how that translates into seats depends on the type of electoral system you favour. I've got a question here from Chris Thomas. And it says, is it fair to say that first past the post will always prevent the UK from having a truly multi-party system at Westminster level? And I think the answer to that question is probably. I think it's very unlikely that we would have a truly multi-party system where there were several parties in government. But again, what we've seen in the last 10 years is that actually first past the post, our electoral system, which is supposed to produce single party government, in 2 elections out of the 4 we've had since 2010 has failed to do so. And by the same token, we see that in Scotland, where we have a more proportional system, we still have one party rule. So the electoral system isn't the be all and end all of that. But I think it is unlikely that we would have a very, very multi-party system where several parties were represented in government on a routine basis. Now, Chris asks, is it impossible or unlikely that the SNP or Lib Dems will ever get more than 60 or 70 seats? Well, the SNP will be unlikely to get more than 59 because there's only 59 seats in Scotland. And of course, in 2015, they did very well, winning 56 of those 59. With the Lib Dems, they got very close to getting around 70 seats, and it's possible that they could do even better if we saw a collapse in the Conservatives. But even in the depths of the Conservative fortunes in the early 2000s, the Lib Dems didn't really benefit from that. So I think it is fair to say that the first past the post plays an important role, but it's not the only factor in play. Lucy asks whether the UK is suffering from a democratic deficit. Now, if by that you mean, is there a disconnect between voters and government? I think there can be, but at the same time, we have a choice as voters about whether we get involved. And it's still the case, sadly, that less than 3/4 of us do actually exercise our right to vote. I think it's absolutely critical that we all get involved in voting, and voting is like any other choice that you make. Your choices are always constrained, whether you're in the supermarket, whether you're in the clothes shop, whether you're voting. And I think it is always the question that you choose the one that is closest to what you would like. It's very unlikely that you'll like everything any single party does, but I do think it's important that people get involved. And unfortunately, the outcome of that is that if fewer people do get involved, then we can end up with a deficit. Now, ironically, the thing that's caused the most difficulty between voters and government is actually as a result of the referendum. Now, what the referendum on the European Union did was expose a real division between what a majority, albeit a slim majority of the population wanted, which was for the United Kingdom to leave the European Union, and what many of the elite politicians wanted. And we saw a lot of frustration between what government was doing and what Parliament was doing over Brexit and what apparently the people wanted. Now, what that throws up is a real challenge of holding referendums in a representative democracy, because the two in many ways are incompatible. On the one hand, a representative democracy is designed to represent our interests, but also act on our behalf. The reason we have a representative democracy is because for most of us, we haven't got the time or the expertise to get involved in every single political decision. But then if you have a direct democracy, an exercise like a referendum, you can end up where the two are in conflict. And we saw a lot of that over Brexit, and very strong divisions in British society, given that the result was so close. So do we have a democratic deficit? I think there's some evidence of that, but I have to say that some of that is our own fault if we don't turn out and vote. Nicole, in this contest, asks, did the turnout of the general election shock you? Not really. In fact, in some ways, I expected it to be a bit lower, given that it was on a cold, wet Thursday in December, and we normally vote on a rather sunny Thursday in May. And we know, for example, that that elections and votes during winter months, often it's more difficult to mobilize people because it gets dark much more easily. Parties are less likely to campaign after dark. So if you talk to canvassers, there are two rules about canvassing. Don't canvass during the dark because people don't want to open the door, and don't canvass during EastEnders because people are watching the telly. You might add to that, don't canvass during Champions League matches. So we have some, it's always a challenge holding an election in December. And so I think in some ways it was quite gratifying that turnout was as high as it was, even though I think it would have been better if it was if turnout had been higher. Christopher asks, how secure is the voting system? Now, if by that do you mean how susceptible to fraud it is, well, we have, in some ways, that's impossible to say definitively, but the way in which we vote at the moment in this country is very much paper-based. So you can't vote online, you can't vote over the phone. For most people, you have to go to the polling station and cast your ballot, and then it's counted at the local authority. Some people vote by post, and if anyone has tried to vote by post, it is not necessarily a straightforward process, and it is reasonably secure as long as the postal votes are going through. I think what we've seen in Britain, and this is reflected in studies by the Electoral Commission, that unfortunately, as we've opened up more alternatives to voting in person and introduced what we call postal voting on demand, so anybody can have a postal vote, the potential for electoral fraud has grown. And we have unfortunately seen some examples of that. But by and large, I think our electoral system is secure. But what this question might be getting at is whether or not our campaigns are secure from foreign interference. So we saw a lot of talk, for example, of whether or not the Russians were involved in digital campaigns in the Brexit referendum. Well, I think this is obviously a very serious matter and one that has to be investigated very strongly. But our evidence from looking at how parties campaign shows that although digital campaigning is increasing in importance, the most persuasive technique that parties can apply is meeting voters on the doorstep or in the street. So face-to-face contact is the thing that really delivers either shoring up your own vote, making sure your people turn out, or perhaps on occasions persuading people to vote for your side rather than the other. So I think we have to be very mindful of the risks, but at the same time, I think it's also fair to say that our system is pretty secure. At some point, I dare say we will move to online voting, but I don't think that time has yet come. Okay, do we have any other questions? Actually, we had another one from Aisha on whether the voting system could be hacked and misused when in the wrong hands. Well, I think that's the sort of thing that I was looking to talk about just then. Okay, well, if there's no other questions, I'll leave you to enjoy what is a gloriously sunny day, and good luck with the rest of your studies, and we wish you all the best, and do keep in touch and do come along to some more of these Brunel events. Very nice to meet you, albeit virtually. Stay safe and enjoy the sun. Okay, cheerio.